We have a special guest today, Dr. Josh Swamidass. He joins us to talk about his article for Christianity Today on the infamous Scopes trial. This summer marked the 100th anniversary of that very significant event. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that this was the OJ trial of the time. In fact, it probably surpassed the OJ Simpson trial as far as impact. And as Josh points out in his article, it still echoes today and in many ways parallels the times in which we're living. So, Bill, if you would do the honors and introduce Josh, we'll dive into this article.
Joshua Swamidass is an information biologist and physician at Washington University in St. Louis. He's also the author of a book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, which has served to spark a great deal of contemporary discussion about the historicity of Adam and Eve and the character of the Genesis narratives concerning this couple. And I first met Josh several years ago at a conference at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I was struck by both his presence as well as what he was saying, and that was the beginning of a wonderful friendship that has continued right up to the present time.
Yeah, it's amazing how far we've come. That was in 2017 that we met, Bill. I remember it as clear as day, the way we met and what we talked about. And man, so much has happened since then, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, Josh, on the topic today, how about giving us an overview of the Scopes trial for anyone who might be unfamiliar with it?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. There's a lot that I can say, so definitely redirect me and we can slow down and go deeper to different parts of it. You mentioned the O.J. Simpson trial, and that's a good comparison in some important ways. So the O.J. Simpson trial was in the 90s. That was the first trial that was televised live across the country, and it had a huge cultural impact. Even though the legal questions being addressed weren't really that pressing, it became like a topic of, a shared experience that we all had of just looking at this trial, thinking about it, trying to understand how this impacted how we think about a whole bunch of big cultural issues. Something similar was going on with the Scopes trial. In a similar way, it was really the first trial ever that was broadcast live by radio every single step of the way through for the entire week and a half that it happened. And at that point in 1925, most families actually had a radio, and they would be gathering around most of the country, and even people outside the country. They would be reading about this. There was hundreds of reporters there, and it just captured the country and much of the world's attention for about a week and a half. And once again, another similarity is at the center of it were celebrities. So there's O.J. Simpson, who was a movie star at the time, and an NFL star. In this case, actually, I think it's fair to say that Williams Jennings Bryan, who is the head of the prosecution, and Charles Darrow, who is the head of the defense, were far more famous even than OJ was. And these two were really almost mythological figures, just very, very famous people. Williams Jennings Bryan was kind of at the end of his career. He'd run for president 3 times. He didn't get elected any time. But then what happened is, like during the decade of the 1910s, he was just off a string of major political successes in women's suffrage and in the temperance movement too. So he was a key person arguing for the right of women to vote. This is like in the post-war period, World War I, where they're really wondering, maybe there needs to be more Christian women being able to vote, and they would have held back all these, testosterone-filled men from a world war. And so he was arguing for that, and then also temperance trying to deal with this vice of alcohol and really making that illegal. That became a constitutional amendment. And then the last thing he kind of turns to in this last act of his life really is looking at the nefarious impact of evolution in public school education, which is interesting because the public school movement was just starting then. At that time, only a minority of people actually went to high school. Public high schools here in the United States started as a very local grassroots thing initially. That movement was starting. It wasn't the same as it is today. But that's really where he really starts to find his voice in a stride as not just a person making these arguments for policy now, but he's really this public Christian. He's identifying as a conservative, fundamentalist, literalist Christian, really trying to fight against kind of those encroaches of liberalism and seeing evolution as this really core thing. So that's kind of his public personality and what he's doing. And it's coming into direct clash with this other force, Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow, he called himself an agnostic, definitely wouldn't call himself an atheist. But in many ways, he's similar to the new atheists of the 90s, like, Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and who's the other guy? Dawkins, right? Dawkins. And just a very large media presence, highly skeptical, and it's fair to call him anti-Christian. He's so even if he is an agnostic, and you take him as a word on that, he's definitely leaning towards atheism, and he's very anti-Christian. And the two of them had been dueling in newspaper articles back and forth. And Brian was thinking he was being evasive as these questions about Christianity, and so they both agree to do this trial. And this trial is about actually something called the Butler Act in Tennessee. It's held in Dayton, which is a small town there, and it's about whether or not evolution can be taught in a public high school. And there's a Tennessee law that Brian had been a part of that tried to outlaw it. But John T. Scopes was a test case of a teacher who claimed to have actually taught evolution and violating the act. And he was a test case that the nascent ACLU, this ends up being the very first case that the ACLU wins, the American Civil Liberties Union. They didn't win it initially, I should say. They won it on appeal, but this ends up becoming their most high-profile first case, really, to defend Scopes, and they asked Darrow to actually defend it. So there ends up being this epic clash between these two ideas, like kind of these Christians that are opposed to teaching evolution with this high public profile, clashing with this anti-Christian agnostic atheists, saying that we're allowed to teach it. And what unfolded in the trial was just an amazing story. Once again, it was made for television, even though television wasn't yet made.
Yeah, and they've made movies too, on it, and a Broadway play, a whole bit.
It's called Inherit the Wind, which incidentally is important. That mythology of what happens isn't actually what happened in the trial. That's an important point. But yeah.
And your article relates the highly unusual move when Clarence Darrow put William Jennings Bryan on the stand as a witness. There was this audible gasp. I mean, that was highly unusual. And this became a sensational showdown. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, to draw analogies to O.J. Simpson, it might have been when they asked him to actually try on the gloves in the middle of the trial to see if they fit. I mean, I don't think you could find any analog of that's actually ever happened before in a criminal trial court, but something weird happened in that moment. So this is something weird too. And there's a lot of things that were irregular about it. So to get into the navigating back and forth, so Clarence Darrow wasn't part of the ACLU, and he wanted to use this as a strategy to argue against, religion, at large. But the ACLU didn't want him to do that because they realized they needed to win over religious folk. But their initial strategy didn't work. And so they decided that really what was supposed to be the last day of the trial, when everything was wrapping up, all the legal questions had been decided, everything was settled, they decided to surprise the court. And no one really saw this coming. They decided it really the day before. They talked about it with one another. Darrow got permission to do this from his team, but they didn't really tell anyone what they were going to do. And it's important because kind of by almost a stroke of luck for the showmanship of it all, it had gotten so hot there during the summer in Dayton. This is pre-air conditioning too, that they decided to set up a stage outside. and actually just have the final part of the trial as it closes on the stage as well. And so there's even more people because now it's this open air stadium feel almost to it, and with hundreds of reporters there. And at that moment, Darrow basically calls Williams Jennings Bryan to the stand to testify. Totally surprising everyone. I mean, I've talked to my friends who are lawyers and experts in legal history. Everyone qualifies this by saying, this is highly unusual. It does not usually happen. But then I asked people, like, you say that, but can you give me any other example where a prosecutor testifies on the stand under oath in the trial that he's prosecuting? Like, is that ever, can you tell me any other example? And then they'll say, well, this is kind of the typical academic hedging of, you don't want to find that one. No one knows of any example where this has ever happened before. And the judge clearly knows this, and probably against his better instincts says, well, I guess, if Williams Jennings Bryan is okay with it, I'll allow it. And Bryan is okay with it on the condition that he's going to get a chance to put Darrow on the stand too. That never happens actually. But in this really surprising turn where it just seemed like the trial was literally about to conclude in the next 10 minutes, Bryan goes on the stand on this gigantic stage with hundreds of reporters and like hundreds of people watching. And what proceeds, and it's all like in the trial transcripts, is this back and forth between Darrow and Bryan that frankly had almost nothing to do with the trial itself. It was really this public debate about Christianity, evolution, and some very memorable back and forth, which is notable even to our academic work, Craig, where he asks about Cain's wife.
Yeah, he actually asked him that. Where did Cain get his wife?
Yeah,
and he says, I don't know. She's hidden so that agnostics will hunt for her, I think was his reply. So it was really a spectacle,
Josh, is there a transcript of the trial? Was there a transcript?
Oh, yeah. There's a court reporter there, like, typing everything down. It's entered into the official record. And it became such an important historical event that all, there's just so much material out there now on this. It's a really good read, actually, if you have a moment. It's entertaining to the nth degree. Another thing that came up is the age of the earth and whether or not to take the days as literal or not. But see, here's the thing. It's interesting. Bryan calls himself a fundamentalist. He calls himself a literalist, but he actually reads the days of Genesis as long ages. So he's a lot like Hugh Ross in this regard. And so he has, I would say, a sophisticated understanding of literalism. It's not this narrow, wooden sort of uninformed young earth creationism. He's not that all young earth creationism is uninformed, but he's definitely not in that camp. He's kind of a proponent of literalism, but arguing that the earth is really old, that there could have been people before Adam and Eve. Like, none of that's actually really the key issue for him when he's talking about this.
Let's touch on one more thing, Josh, legally about it. As you point out in your article, this trial was a result of the violation of the Butler Act, which forbade the teaching of human evolution in particular. But let me ask you, just from your reading and maybe talking with your legal friends, how could that have passed constitutional muster? I suppose that in 1925, there was a more Christian consensus in the country. But haven't attempts to legislate what can be taught as science generally failed?
Yeah, so there's two reasons why it wasn't overturned. The first is a technical issue. It would have had to gotten appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court at that point. And so what happened is that initially it was appealed, and in the federal appeals court, I'm sorry, I don't think it was even federal appeals. It was actually in the state appeals court. It was overturned for a technicality. They didn't even really consider this issue. After that afternoon, basically every judge involved with it just thinks the whole thing is a circus. They want to rid themselves of it, and that's why Darrow doesn't go on the stand eventually. It just becomes a circus. I think there's actually nothing important legally here. Let's get this circus out of here. Huh. So that's why, because it never actually gets high enough that question gets considered. They're like, we're not even going to deal with that. We're not going to take it that seriously. But the other reason why it even happened is that it wasn't really yet established in jurisprudence that the First Amendment protections actually constrain the states yet. So this was a state law. It wasn't a federal law, and it didn't actually get in front of the Supreme Court. And that actually gets developed later. So it's only, I think it's in I forget if it's 65 or 64, that it becomes very clear that that because it was motivated to protect a religious belief, it's unconstitutional, even if it's done by just merely a state government. In contrast, the argument that was being made at that time is that it wasn't teaching a religious view. It was just telling them that they couldn't teach another view. So that you couldn't teach. So that's something a state was allowed. So basically, there's developments in that legal context that's happened since then that have really changed it. So that's why it was then it was okay, and now it wasn't. I'd say another thing too that's important, that's a little bit surprising when you look back at kind of what's going on in the categories there, is that the ACLU, if you think about it, is called the American Civic Liberties Union, right? They're thinking about individual rights, which is the framing that all of us have right now. But at that time, that's not actually what the dominant framing for rights were. What Brian was really concerned about was majoritarian rights. He really was concerned about the right of a community to set the rules for itself, even if that would be in conflict with an individual in that community's rules. Now, we really shifted then in a large number of ways. Most of us have been convinced by the ACLU's argument that, actually the rights of the individual are important, even if the majority of people in a community think something else should happen. And we need to find accommodation for that. So these are just shifts in society and politics that don't really align well on what we think about our normal left-right divides of, Republican and Democrat. That's actually part of also why it's helpful to look at history to see how things have changed since then.
Hmm. Now, in your article, Josh, you point out that the times were ripe for the controversy stirred by this trial. The country was going through a modernist versus fundamentalist fight. What can you tell us about that contest?
Yeah, so I would say that if you're a Christian who's trying to be thoughtful about where we are and how we got here in this moment in the United States, this is probably one of the most important pieces of history that you never learned in high school to really learn. It's the story of this theological conflict that happened in American churches at the turn of the century, a little over 100 years ago. It's called the fundamentalist Modernist divide. That ends up defining so much of our current moment to today, and it actually defines the context of the Scopes trial. Well, what happened is that modernism, which is a particular approach to Christianity, arose in Europe primarily. And in this approach basically said, well, we've learned all this stuff from science, and we're learning all this stuff from the Enlightenment, and we need to modernize Christian faith by getting rid of all of its antiquated beliefs. Things like the virgin birth, the resurrection, the idea that the Bible is really, inspired in any sense, and Adam and Eve. And we need to just adopt evolution because science has told us that's true. Critical theories showed us that the Bible has gone through tons of changes, and it's definitely just a human word. It's not God's word. But we're still Christians, so we're going to go to your seminaries and we want to be your pastors and all that. And they were nearly total in their takeover in Europe. And there, in really the turn of the century, there was starting to become a pushback. And the pushback was different in how it played out in the United States, where there never was a modernist takeover in the same way, and what happened in Europe. So in Europe, Craig, you studied under Pannenberg, right?
Yes.
And so he's what some people would call a neo-modernist, because in that context, he's saying, well, no, actually, Jesus really, really did rise from the dead. Right?
Yeah, I think that modernism's legacy does live on in the church, although someone like Pannenberg is regarded as a conservative and even a reactionary because he does believe in the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. But that puts him in conflict with many German systematic theologians, and would not align him with these modernists of the early 20th century.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, so Karl Barth is another classic one people really recognize too, right? I mean, and Pannenberg doesn't affirm the virgin birth, but he sees something about the resurrection. But so I think if you're going to kind of look at the European story, it's kind of like a frog boiling in water. It's to the point where the frog gets cooked, and then maybe there's a guy kind of does a restoration in a few individuals in that movement. What happens in America is totally different. There's some debates that happen in seminaries between Briggs and B.B. Warfield and in the late 1800s. But then it really comes to the head and I believe it's 1909 when 3 Presbyterian ministers come forward to be ordained by the denomination, but they can't commit to affirming the virgin birth. And this creates a massive controversy. And it starts with Presbyterians, it spreads to Baptists and to really essentially every denomination in the entire country. Because while it was like a frog boiling the water in Europe, when it hits the United States, it's different. Like the water's already hot, and people are like, well, if this is where it leads, this is a complete disaster. We don't want to have anything to do with it. And so there's a much stronger reaction to it. And that's really leads to the formation of what's been called the fundamental movement, or the fundamentalist movement. But it's important to recognize that the fundamentalists back then 100 years ago are very different than what we would call fundamentalists today. So they're much more, they're a lot closer to what we would call evangelical today, actually. Not in a political sense, but a theological sense. So they're ecumenical, they're international. They're concerned with just 5 core teachings that most of us today would affirm. At minimum, I'd say most evangelicals would affirm entirely, possibly with just some modifications of the language on inerrancy.
Well, I would like to hear, Josh, if you can do this from memory, a list of the 5 fundamentals that the fundamentalists insisted on.
Yeah, so the 5 fundamentals were the inerrancy of Scripture, the miracles of Jesus, and this is from memory, so we can go back and check it too. It's the virgin birth, the physical resurrection of Jesus, and a substitutionary atonement. So those are the 5 things. And these are all 5 things that are being challenged by the modernists. And I would say that there's kind of an unspoken 6th one, that if they were to add a 6th, almost certainly it'd be this. It would be a historical Adam and Eve.
Though it's interesting that creation is not one of the fundamentals.
Yeah, so if you look at actually what happens in this debate, the first thing that goes every time is a historical Adam and Eve. Then the next was the virgin birth, and the next was the resurrection. And you can actually see the centrality of those claims laid out. I mean, the core of the Christian faith is Jesus rising from the dead. Yeah. And that's why, I'm pretty certain, and I think we can have confidence, even though Pannenberg did not affirm the virgin birth, right, he did affirm the resurrection. I believe that we're going to see him in heaven as a brother in Christ, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Even though I think he's wrong about the virgin birth, there's something far more central about the resurrection than the virgin birth. No. And I actually don't know of anyone that rejects the resurrection but affirms the virgin birth. I just don't know of anyone who did that, right? And then after that would be the virgin birth. So then you have Karl Barth as an example, a person who does that, but then we reject historical Adam and Eve. And then we have kind of like the neo-modernists today of people, like the evolutionary creationists and like Scott McKnight, Kenton Sparks, and a lot of them, they're more, or Peter Enns, they're more, they reject the historical Adam, but they would affirm the virgin birth, Jesus' miracles, and that. So you can kind of see that priority kind of arising there.
Well, now, I'm intrigued by your comment in the article, Josh, that it was almost a historical accident that evolution and modernism became bundled together, and fundamentalism with anti-evolution. Can you unpack that further?
Yeah, so the reason why, and it makes sense when you look at the history how it happened, but it didn't have to happen that way. And I think the key individuals I'd point to is B.B. Warfield and also James Orr. So B.B. Warfield is at Princeton. He's the one arguing against Briggs. He's kind of the father of fundamentalism. And he writes about evolution, and he's open to it. he's tentatively open. And of course, they didn't have the evidence behind it that we have today. He has really no problem at all with God using evolution to create, over long periods of time, to create, animal and plant life. The one place where he has reservations, it's like a pause, is when it comes to human evolution, particularly the narratives about Adam and Eve. He doesn't know how to make sense of that, but he thinks there's got to be some way, and he wants to see that resolved first, but he's open to it. Then the other person is James Orr. James Orr is a famous Scottish theologian who wrote, I think, more of the fundamentalist essays than anyone else. And so there's the fundamentals. They were started out as pamphlets. There's around 80 of these essays that are published eventually in 1915 by Biola University. They're called the fundamentals. They're kind of the foundational documents of the fundamentalist movement. And there's James Orr there, and he writes an article that deals with origins and what matters there. Now, of course, there is an anonymous anti-evolution article in the fundamentals too, but there's James Orr, who's far more important, and he talks about evolution. And he takes a view that's very, very similar to B.B. Warfield's. He just sees zero theological problems with an ancient Earth, with God using evolution to create life. Animal life and plant life. But the question that he has, a place where he wants to press into it, and he doesn't want to swallow evolution whole, is when it comes to historical Adam and Eve, because of what it seems that Scripture is saying about that. And so, they're not the first of the. They're I'd say really a key place as leaders of the fundamentalist movement. And that's where the direction really could have gone, if not for Brian and the trial. Brian and the trial really changes it and makes it something where now this really becomes like the sixth fundamental is not merely affirming a historical Adam. It becomes rejecting evolution.
And Josh, back to your article for a moment. You quote now, on paper, the Scopes trial was a victory for Bible-believing Christians, but it also marked the beginning of Christian cultural isolationism, which eventually cost us our voice of influence in contributing to moral and ethical discourse in the public square. End of quote. You're pointing out as conservative Christians were either expelled from or left institutions, they formed their own institutions and became more isolated. When do you think this started to turn around?
Well, let's start talking about what actually happened first with that, and then how maybe it's turned around, because it has turned around, actually. I would say in a great deal in my generation, actually. But that clash between Darrow and Brian on the stand, it's hard to overestimate the influence that had historically. And it became somewhat of a Rorschach test for who you are. You tell how you responded to it. Christians that were these fundamentalists, these people that, frankly, I would identify at that time, because I'm going to go with the side that affirms the resurrection of Jesus, right? I would look at that, we would look at that and we would say, wow, Brian was the champion, our champion there. He was faithful in this public sphere, really declaring the gospel in this way. He became a martyr. He actually ends up literally dying a week after the trial, kind of just cementing this as such an epic moment where this is his real last public act in an important way of really standing for a faithful Christianity. What Darrow succeeded in doing, though, for a separate set of observers, is cementing fundamentalism as backwards, incoherent, not thoughtful, an idiotic approach to the world that isn't really, it doesn't make sense with itself and isn't really in touch with science or anything that matters. He really wanted to humiliate Brian on the stand. Now, Brian stood strong and wasn't humiliated, but a lot of people walked away with Darrow's narrative of it, and it gets cemented in things like Inherit the Wind. And this goes deeper, because what happens is, in reaction to that cultural split, Christians at that time that were faithful followers of Jesus, most of them really withdrew or were kicked out of every major institution. And so this happens at Princeton Seminary in the 1930s. It happens in just about, at that time, before this, there were faithful Christians at every major academic institution that were openly Christian. There was divinity schools attached to places like Harvard and all of these other places, but that changes really in the coming decades, and they all become taken over by a modernist and then purely secular and even atheist approach. And fundamentalists end up starting our own institutions. That's that's close to when Biola was already formed, but it's kind of in this moment that things like Bob Jones University get formed. All these other institutions that are in parallel, essentially, to these secular institutions start to form, and they just get fed up of being treated that way and kind of form their own separate institutions, and it really ends up isolating, and you really end up having these two worlds. The Christian world, and then kind of like the secular public world at large, where there are Christians, but they're just because someone says they're a Christian there doesn't mean that they're going to affirm these really fundamental beliefs that we think are important. Now, how did that change, you asked? Well, it took a long time, because that's the problem, I think, with when we kind of delegate our thinking and our approach to these cultural issues to big, high-profile political clashes. They don't always get worked out in the best way, and they have a huge political impact, huge institutional impact that lasts for decades. And we get stuck with the conclusions of those in ways that really can be deeply harmful. What happens, I think, is this slow movement that God really did to really restore it through the work of scholars, including you, Bill Craig, I think, in important ways of kind of really trying to not just do pastoral work, but actually engage with the best science that's out there, do solid academic work out there. That was the generation before me in important ways, right? Yes. But then in the 90s and in the early 2000s, there was, I would say, this change that happened in a large number of campus ministries, and also ministries like the Harvey Fellowship by the Mustard Seed Foundation is another really key one, though they're certainly not the full story, and also the Veritas forums, though they're not the full story, where they started to very intentionally cultivate this view among Christians of that, you know what, you can be a faithful follower of Jesus in academia, and not only that, God might be calling you there. And I was one of those Christians that got that call to go to secular academia and be a faithful Christian there. Mm-hmm. And all of my training was in secular institutions, but God really called me in this way that I deeply felt to go be to really fulfill, to be a faithful follower of Jesus there in a very missional sense. And that happened, and something has really revived there to now where 30 years downstream of when I was an undergraduate, I think it's fair to say that there is, really hundreds of public Christians in secular academia now, in really every field, from the sciences to the humanities and law and medicine, and in terms of non-public Christians that are faithful there, maybe even thinking about joining the public conversation. I think I don't think there's good estimates, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was thousands. And that's something that just did not exist when you were an undergrad, Bill, right?
Yeah. I think that although we don't have time to talk about it, we want to give credit to those early pioneers in the late 40s and 50s, people like Carl F.H. Henry, Harold Ockenga, Harold Lindsell, Billy Graham, who broke this cultural isolationism and began to re-engage with the academy. And we're standing on their shoulders today.
That's
and in my
absolutely
own field,
true. Yeah. I would also add Bernard Rahm to that too, but then Billy Graham and John Stott. So when we talk about evangelical now, it really ends up being this mediating place between fundamentalism of the past and kind of the modernists. We're trying to kind of resynthesize a middle ground that doesn't abandon these institutions of higher learning, recognizes that there's some at least bounded legitimacy to science. And there might be ways to engage with things like evolution or the Big Bang, and in ways that are productive. We don't want to swallow that whole like the modernists did, but we also don't want to isolate from and just take a hard no pass on it, as happened with the fundamentalists as a result.
Yeah, in my field, I think turning point came around 1967 when Alvin Plantinga published his book, God and Other Minds. And Plantinga was just a philosophy teacher at a little Christian college in Michigan, Calvin College. And yet it became evident to everyone that here was a man who was writing with the same caliber and on the same field with the best secular philosophers. And in Plantinga's train has followed a renaissance of Christian philosophy that is ongoing today. And this has really transformed the face of the discipline that I'm involved in and that I'm so grateful to be a part of. It's wonderful to be alive and working in this discipline today, as opposed to back during those dark days of the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Now, to push forward,
you as philosophers, because of Plantinga, are much farther ahead than really any other field. I think we're like we're kind of really at the cusp of that in many fields now. It's a far bigger than just philosophy now, but we're just a lot farther behind. But I think that's a great way to tell the story too. But I just want to emphasize one point, is that this has in many ways been very accidental. It is really not, it is kind of going against what the cultural forces set in play 100 years ago. It's really, I mean, it's a movement. It's been several things in several places and several institutions where people are just recognizing that that God actually has not abandoned the university. He has a place and a role for us here.
Yes.
And giving us like these counterintuitive calls, at least for me, I didn't make sense to me. And I even look at your career, Bill. It doesn't make sense. It's not like there was a lot of people doing what you've done, you know? But somehow God put that in your mind to do, and he made it possible in a way that, that has just been happening with a large number of people.
Yeah. Now, in your article, Josh, you write, and I quote, "In the years since the Scopes trial, anti-evolutionism became tightly linked or bundled with Orthodox Christianity in the American church. That is, until the evangelical movement began disentangling questions of science from the essential gospel truths to allow for more thoughtful and faithful engagement with both." How are they becoming disentangled? Do you think that the influence of young earth creationist ministries is declining now?
Well, so the story is a little winding. So actually, most fundamentalists 100 years ago were not young earth creationists. That was kind of like a weird Seventh-day Adventist belief. They were all, old earth creationists. There was like these famous debates about whether or not to take them as 6 literal days or day age within an old earth creationist framework, because most fundamentalists actually took them as literal days in a gap theory framework. It includes even Bob Jones Sr., who's just this bastion of young earth creationism now at Bob Jones University. Bob Jones Sr. was a gap theorist. He thought the earth was old. But it was in really 1960 that young earth creationism really takes off and becomes really dominant in fundamentalism. So that's very recent. So there's a bit of a winding path. So it goes from old earth creationism to there, but that's actually also when, in the 1960s, when the evangelicals arise with Billy Graham and John Stott in particular. And there's this thoughtful re-engagement. And so, and part of the divide was honestly also over segregation. So the fundamentalists at that time were solidly pro-segregationists. Mm-hmm. And so all of that stuff was linked together into a political bundle. But the evangelicals were like, well, maybe this segregation thing isn't actually what God wants for us. Maybe we should integrate. And that was like a key thing that was important actually to Billy Graham, for example.
Yes.
But then also they were saying, well, is there some better ways to think about evolution? So Bernard Rahm had written this book that was important. That actually was part of what provoked the young earth creationist resurgence too, because they were responding to his book. But then John Stott writes about this as well. He has like this cautious openness to it. Once again, with the caveat of the historical Adam. And likewise, Derek Kidner, who is at Tyndale House, writes during this time this very influential commentary on on Genesis, and he's a theologian, but he makes space for the possibility of evolution too, with the caveat of a historical Adam and also the special creation of Eve. And so that starts to create the space to start thinking about it. But it wasn't really until when I was in my PhD that there becomes a major public proponent of a faithful evangelical view alongside evolution, and that would be with The Language of God and Francis Collins in 2006 when that book comes out. And that was like a breath of fresh air when I read it, because I was like, oh wow, this guy is talking about Jesus rising from the dead, referencing C.S. Lewis, and he certainly believes that Jesus rose from the dead, and he came to faith from being an atheist. And yet he also sees legitimacy with a historical Adam and Eve. And he quotes C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis deals with this issue too. He can come to terms with evolution with the caveat of a historical fall, referencing a historical Adam and Eve as well. And then, Francis Collins in that book, this is before Biologos kind of takes its very anti-Adam and Eve turn. And that book was actually very friendly to the idea as well. So that created kind of like this space for a lot of us to start thinking about this. When Biologos forms later, it really goes down a more of a neo-modernist path. It takes a very anti-Adam and Eve approach, and that starts to create lots of problems for evangelicals. And that's actually where we fit into the story too, right, Bill?
Yes.
And so, that's maybe a story for later in this conversation. But the consistent thing you can kind of see through this entire history is that Christians, when we're thinking slow and carefully, not politically, we can make space for evolution as long as we can affirm the things we believe Scripture is telling us about Adam and Eve.
By way of summary, what are some of the lessons that you think we can learn from this controversy surrounding the Scopes trial?
Oh man, once again, there's a lot to talk about here. I just say that history does matter. We should look at this. It explains a lot of weird features of why things are the way they are now. I'd also say too that there's this tendency we have to oversimplify in cultural wars and politics of kind of bundling things together tightly that may or may not be a good fit. We need to be very cautious about that. I don't presume to have any control what happens in the public political discourse. We as Christians should not be looking to that as our guide. We need to have space for more nuanced conversation that's more thoughtful, that recognizes shades of gray and makes finer distinctions, and really doesn't let that discourse define the things that we're going to say are important to us as we think theologically and also in the church. I think that's really important. And I think finally, I'd say too that the one thing at a meta level that's very similar about that time 100 years ago now is that faithful Christians, or evangelical Christians, as you might call them, are really in the middle of a massive theological identity crisis. That was true back then. That's true now, to the point that many evangelicals aren't even sure if they want to call themselves evangelicals as Americans, and we're not really sure what to do with all these new theological challenges and who we are. We've forgotten our history too, which makes it worse. We are at a really critical moment. This is the sort of moment where new bundles form and can have an impact for a very long time, for generations to come, even maybe the next century. We need to think carefully about how we steward our voice, how we think about this, and what sorts of bundles we are going to really allow to come into place, to hope that we actually do things that are going to really support the gospel and make the gospel more clear in our generation and the generations to come too, and not bind it to things that are really not essential.
Gentlemen, as we wrap up today, it's always been pretty evident that Adam and Eve have always been lightning rods for these controversies. It was then, it is now. Both of you have written and published on this. How has your work contributed to this long conversation? Let's hear from both of you as we wrap up.
I'd love to hear from Bill first on that question.
Okay. I needed to study the historical Adam and Eve in preparation for my volume on the doctrine of man in my systematic philosophical theology. And so I tried to bracket what modern science tells us about human origins and to just look at the narratives of Genesis and the teaching of the New Testament. And I became convinced that the Bible does commit us to the historicity of this founding pair of the human race. But it seemed to me that the narratives of the primeval history of Genesis are describing real events, real people, but in the figurative and metaphorical language of myth, and therefore should not be read literalistically. And in particular, I don't think that they commit us to saying that Adam and Eve lived just a few tens of thousands of years ago. And so in my book, In Quest of the Historical Adam, I defend the historicity of a founding pair of the human race, but I place them very deep in the primordial past, somewhere around 750,000 or more years ago, where they are the universal progenitors of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens, all of the human beings that have lived on this planet.
So I think what I would say as to why our two books are really important in this long conversation is that if you look at this long conversation, the basic assumption that everyone has had is that science, and particularly evolution, seriously challenges our beliefs about Adam and Eve to the point that we probably have to abandon them if we're going to agree with what science is telling us. I think even among the people who were trying to make space for evolution as faithful Christians, this is what their struggle was, because they couldn't figure out how to fully make sense of it. I think, Bill, where our work is really critical is I think it might really be putting a twist in the story and putting that to rest and saying that actually there's quite a large range of ways that this is entirely consistent with evolution to think about an orthodox, faithful way of reading it. Genesis and a historical Adam and Eve. I mean, you might read it more literalistically, you might read it more mythologically, but this idea of there being a historical fall has really no tension and conflict with science. And maybe that was a fundamental misturn in the conversation to begin with. And so I think that's what has really collapsed and really collapsed the difficulty and the conflict in this conversation now, where even young earth creationists are often acknowledging that there are faithful ways to affirm evolution, even if they don't think that's what actually happened, because they're looking at work like ours and recognizing, okay, that is actually, being accepted as good science, and it's actually ticking off all of the really critical things that we really need to see theologically.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for being on our podcast today. Your work has been tremendously stimulating, not only to me, but to the Christian church in general. And we're so grateful for what you're doing and your willingness to have this conversation with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.